Okay, so here's my prompt. As always, there's no single right way to do this, so don't worry if yours looks different. Implement the writer step to generate the final newsletter as Markdown. Newsletter post model base table pattern. Note how we can be pretty terse here. We don't need a lot of prose to describe what to do, and the patterns are all well established at this point. We want a subject line, so a high CTR email subject line. We need a preview text. That's the text shown in the email client preview. I'm actually also showing this in the newsletter post on the website. Then we need the Markdown content, so the full newsletter body in Markdown. And again, if you want to instead save it in a more structured way, where you have the individual sections as their own fields, that's totally fine as well. And then the database fields here. So then for the writer step, it's also not a batch step. It's a single LLM call. We load the winning candidate, its business model, and supporting articles. This is important, right? So the writer step can actually include citations in the appropriate places. We'll use the Gemini 2.5 Pro model. Now we have some instructions about the system prompt. So the prompt should define a newsletter writer persona. The newsletter should follow this section structure. Let's see if I can fit all of this in here. I wish there was a way to expand this. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be. Okay, so we have basically the sections that we just went over, right? So I'm listing all of them, including briefly what that section is about. The user prompt should include the candidate, business model, and supporting article titles and URLs for citation. And then output the final markdown to output/newsletter.md, as well as storing it in the database. Okay, so let's kick this off. This step seems pretty straightforward. There's plenty of precedents at this point in our code base, right? The synthesis step and the deep dive step were all fairly similar, especially the deep dive. So I'm actually proceeding straight to the implementation here. Up to you. There's nothing wrong with using plan mode, but I want to see if it's able to essentially one-shot this. And then if needed, we can always come back and iterate. Okay, that was actually pretty quick. So it says it implemented everything we asked for. Let's take a quick look here. Okay, that sounds good. Let's take a look at the actual files. Here's the migration. As expected, CLI just adds this new step. Then we add the newsletter post base and newsletter post models with the fields that we asked for. Also looks good, no surprises here. Repositories, just a really simple newsletter post repository with a create function. Note that we didn't even specifically request the repository changes in the prompt. It just automatically inferred this based on the existing patterns that we have by now. Once you have those in place, you can really write simpler and simpler prompts with each step. Finally, the actual step implementation. Let's open the full file. All right, writer step. So the main thing here is the system prompt. So let's take a good look at that. You are an expert newsletter writer for a startup-focused publication aimed at solo developers and indie hackers. I like this. Your tone is sharp, opinionated, and practical, like a smart friend who reads the news and connects the dots for you. Write in second person, you. Keep paragraphs short, 2 to 3 sentences max. Use bold for key terms and startup names. Avoid corporate jargon and buzzwords. Okay. You will receive a startup candidate, its full business model, and the source articles that inspired it. Produce a newsletter post in Markdown following this exact section structure. This is important. If you're not super explicit here, you'll find that it might loosely follow this, but it might not actually use the right level headings and things like that. So usually for it to look good, right, you'll want a lot of consistency here. You'll want headers that are all level 2 headings and things like that. So this kind of system prompt usually works very well in really guiding the output format. So we have the signal. Why are we talking about this today? Open with the news hook, the real-world events that make this idea timely, ground the reader in what's happening. That's good. Then we have the problem, what's broken in the market, describe the pain point in concrete terms, make the reader feel the frustration. Okay. The solution, introduce the startup concept by name from the business model, explain what it does and for whom in plain language. This is the aha moment. See, so I think Claude was smart enough to actually look at what's in the business model, what kind of fields do we have, because it doesn't necessarily remember all of this by itself, right? So it probably looked at the business model, saw that it has a name, and then intuited that, the name would be appropriate to include in the solution. The business case, how does it make money? So here, this is also exactly how I want it, with a level 2 heading for the business case, and then nested level 3 headings for the revenue model and go-to-market. We have the moat. Who are the competitors? What's the unfair advantage? Be honest. If the moat is thin, say so and explain how to build one. That's pretty similar to what we already had in the deep dive step. Why now? Cite the specific source articles. Explain the confluence of trends. And then the Builder's Corner, recommend an MVP tech stack. Emphasize this is just one way to build it. The reader should pick tools they already know. Keep it practical and specific. Okay, then we say, that's also good. Do not include a title or H1 heading. The newsletter platform handles that. Start directly with the heading, the signal. So yeah, that's also good guidance. You don't want any kind of duplication there since we broke the heading out into a separate field. Okay, so for inputs, one thing that makes this a little bit unique, I guess, is that we load both the candidate, right? So we load the top candidate for the run, and we load the corresponding business model. So I'm actually noticing this is not the best way to do this. Note how it loads the business model correctly. It simply loads it by run ID. If you remember, each of our models references its associated run through a run ID. So that way everything is sort of, linked to the run. And using the run, we can easily look up any of the models for all of these steps. That's a really helpful way to model things. Now for the candidate, it doesn't look it up by run ID. Rather, it calls this function here to get the top candidate for the run. In fact, it doesn't even have a function to look it up by run ID, right? So for the business model, we have get by run ID. I guess we don't have that for all of them because we haven't needed to look things up by run ID typically, but the database schema supports this. So the candidate repository has get top candidate for run. And if you recall, that's where we actually do the scoring. Right now, we simply do this naively by ordering by candidate score and then taking the top result. And we'll later swap all of this out for a more sophisticated ranking function. Yeah, so this would happen to work fine right now because the scoring is deterministic. It would just look up all 3 candidates for this run, pick the best scoring one, and then continue to develop it into a newsletter post. In theory, that'll continue to work as well, but at best, it means we're doing a lot of unnecessary processing because this will get more complicated, this ranking function in the future. It'll require database lookups and some vector math and things like that to determine similarity to previous articles. And there could definitely be some non-determinism introduced as well. So we shouldn't rely on that. So we have 2 options here. One is, if we look at the business model in here, the business model actually has a candidate ID. So one thing we could do is in our load inputs function, we could load the business model first and then simply look up the candidate using the foreign key on the business model. That might be the simplest way to proceed for now. There is another solution That's actually what I'm doing in my production pipeline. For various reasons, I'm actually persisting the selected candidate ID directly on the run. That way, when I'm browsing my runs, like I have this admin interface that allows me to nicely inspect everything in my database, see the newsletter kind of rendered and the image and all of that. It's kind of a nice, helpful tool. And I can easily go to the run and then from the run get to the candidate that we chose for that particular run. And I find that to be pretty helpful. It's not quite as clean from a data modeling perspective, right? It's a little bit denormalized, but pragmatically speaking, I found this to be useful. So we could tell Claude to introduce that field on the runs, and then we can always look up the selected candidate ID from the run. I think for right now, to keep things simple, we'll tell it to just look up the candidate from the business model, because in practice, that'll work just fine. And actually, before we do this, let's look at the rest of the step that it created. I'm not expecting any surprises there, but just to make sure, so we can give Claude all of our feedback at once. So that's one thing. Process, I'm not really expecting any surprises there. So we have our inputs. As always, it created this private format prompt function. Then we run the agent and turn the output into a newsletter post. So that's all as expected. Persistence shouldn't be surprising either. Actually, there is one difference here compared to the previous step. So we create the newsletter in the database as usual, but then we also create a file, right? Like we told it to. So it's creating the output directory if it doesn't already exist, and then it writes the text to newsletter.md. Some stats, format prompt. All right, this one's definitely more meaty because there's a lot going in here as inputs. So write a newsletter post about this startup idea. So then we have a heading for the candidate, and then we just have all the fields, theme, archetype, and so on. That looks good. Then we have the business model and all the business model fields. Technically, I think some of these are kind of unnecessary. Like, I'm not really sure what the writer is going to do with the score. I guess it'll give it some indication whether this is, a really strong idea or a weak idea. It probably won't hurt to have it in there. So let's keep it as is for now. We can always dial this back if needed. But yeah, that looks like a pretty straightforward way to input all of this. And then we have all the articles. So under source articles, cite these and why now. We'll actually tweak this as well, and I'll tell you why. But yeah, so the structure looks fine. We just append them all as a list. So the article title, the source, and the article URL. That looks reasonable. Now, this might end up only citing the articles in Why Now. And I don't really want that. I think Why Now is the section where they most likely fit in, right? Because that's where we directly talk about the current events that are leading to this idea. However, I do want to be able to organically cite articles wherever it makes sense in any of these sections. I think we want to relax this a little bit and tell it to cite them where it makes sense. Let's ask for these two changes, otherwise this looks great actually. Okay, so I'm giving it these two pieces of feedback. The first one regarding load inputs. Don't call candidate repo.getTopCandidate for run to load the candidate. This function will later change to do more complex ranking and might not even be deterministic. Instead, load the business model first and then simply look up the candidate referenced by the business model. And then regarding article citations, Why Now is a very likely place for article citations, but they don't need to be limited to this. The writer agent should feel free to add article citations organically throughout the article wherever it makes sense. Please update the prompt to be less prescriptive about this. I think that should do the trick. And again, we could do this ourselves, but I'd rather make sure that it holistically looks at the whole prompt, including the system prompt, and make any changes that might be needed. Little side note, it says, good points, let me fix both. I don't know why, it's surprisingly encouraging when it tells you that you're making a good point. It really shouldn't be. I know oftentimes these LLMs really just try to please you and agree with you. And if anything, I'd rather they tell me when I'm wrong. And I have had that happen plenty of times as well. But still, I think it's, I love having these kinds of polite interactions with my agents. Okay, so it very quickly addressed both issues. It says the tests pass. Let's take a quick look here at load inputs. Perfect. That's as expected. So we look up the business model first based on the run ID, and then we look up the candidate based on the business model. It probably had to add a new function here. Oh, I see. It just added this get by ID function that didn't exist yet. And the ID, of course, is on the business model. So, yep, that makes sense. And then down here, it now says cite throughout where relevant. So I'm happy with that. If we find that it doesn't add anything to why now, we can still tune this a bit more in the prompt. But I think this looks pretty good to me.